Hello, everyone. Welcome to our regular Friday lunchtime Sensemaker Live Thinking in partnership with Santander. Thank you, Santander. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise. And so I'm going to take unusually seriously today my obligation to remain at least ostensibly impartial, because our question is, are we done with the dynasty? Can or will anything really change? Coming at the end of quite a week. If a week is a long time in politics, it's a blip in the life of the monarchy. On Sunday, the interview broadcast in the US. On Monday, it broadcast here. On Tuesday, we had a think-in that was focused on what everybody sort of considered to be the immediate impact of the interview. Today, I hope, nothing's off limits, but I hope that we can focus a little more on the future of the royal family, what we want from them, whether we want them at all. And in a sense, I don't need to preface this with spoiler alert. We've already seen in the slides that you might just have seen coming up before we started an answer to the question, are we done with the dynasty? The answer is no. And so perhaps we should have said, why are we not done with the dynasty? But it's surprising in a sense, nonetheless. If you look at, I'm just going to read out a couple of quotes at how the institution is seen from the outside. This is from an admittedly comic Republican writer in the New York Times this week. It is as if he said, the Bush family, the Kardashians, and the Falwells were all rolled into one bejeweled quasi-religious fame cult, topped off with a bracing dose of imperialism. But returning to the question, why aren't we done with them? The British royal family gets a lot of fawning approval from the press, especially here. Here, for example, is a line from a leader in the Times, June 6th, 2012. It is true that we did not vote for her, they say of the Queen. It is also true that she represents the whole country in a way she never could if we had. I think I wrote that, so I feel qualified to describe it as highly debatable, if not complete bilge. But it ran. And I think to an extent it reflected what a lot of people think. So that was 2012. Just before that, in 2011, we had William and Kate's wedding, almost a high watermark, one might argue, of the modern monarchy. 2012 was pretty good as well, especially for the Queen and the Olympics. We had after that Harry and Meghan's wedding, well, some years after that, which worked very well for the firm initially in terms of public acclaim, global renown, and then both of them became pretty miserable inside the family, and the rest, as we say, is history. And in the course of that decade, of course, we've had the unraveling of Prince Andrew's reputation. This is a think-in. There may be some who've not been here before, so let me just say that the main goal is to hear from as many people as possible. So I will be quiet very soon. Make it known either just by writing in the chat what's on your mind, or by raising your electronic hand. Touch the reactions button and you'll see the raise hand button there. We will try to come to you, and we will in due course come back to the slides briefly that my colleague Ella put up. But first, we've got two really much more informed guests on this than I am. One is Dr. Laura Clancy from the University of Lancaster's Department of Sociology, and crucially, author of the forthcoming Running the Family Firm, How the Monarchy Manages Its Image and Our Money. And Dan Stewart, who is international editor at Time magazine, London-based, I think. Hi, Dan. And has written very thoughtfully this week on the aftermath and sort of impact of the interview, as if from an international perspective. But let me come first, if I may, to Laura Clancy. Now, as I say, the book's not out yet. I anticipate quite a splash when it comes out. We'll have to try and get you back. But the blurb, the publisher's blurb, says that it discusses the firm's power, how the firm's power, and I mean the royal family, is disguised through careful stage management of media representations of the royal family. So whatever else happened this week, that stage management went a bit wrong, didn't it? What went wrong, and what do you think happens next?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think so. The book argues that the monarchy kind of relies upon this very careful balance of visibility and invisibility. So we see them being very visible in spectacular forms, I suppose. So things like ceremonies, weddings that you mentioned there in the intro, and also in kind of more ordinary ways. So royal charity work, or when royal babies are born, or pictures of them at home. So we see this kind of quite stage visibility. What we don't see, and what is kept invisible, I would argue, is kind of the inner workings of the institution, and thinking about institutional power. Often when we think about the monarchy, we think about the royal family. So we think about individual royals and their roles within that, and their roles as, I mean, I'm thinking particularly here of like Kate and William and the children, how they kind of perform those ordinary family values. And I think it's actually quite rare for us to think about those inner workings of how the institution works, and how institutional power works. And I agree, I think this interview this week has kind of blown that apart in really interesting ways, particularly some of the language that they were using in that interview. So Meghan even referred to the firm, kind of talking about it as, you know, she said, you know, the private secretary is like the CEO, like she was talking about it in those kind of business terms, which I thought was fascinating, and talking about how they relate to each other and who's in control and stuff. And we never really get access to that. People don't really know what happens. So I think in those ways, the interview was really interesting for kind of drawing attention to those things. And
we don't often discuss it in those terms, despite the fact that there's a whole media industry devoted to covering every movement of every working royal. I mean, in a sense, this comes back to the unwritten compact that Meghan talked about, doesn't it? But do you think that might change? Do you think that going forward from here, let's compartmentalize the tabloids a bit. But do you think there will be a less deferential, more forensic approach by the rest of the media, the broadsheets as they used to be called, and the broadcasters, and perhaps approaching the institution more as I understand it, do in your book, as a corporation?
I mean, I think time will tell. I think it's really difficult to tell. I would say that, you know, this isn't the first time that the royal family have faced this kind of crisis, I don't think. I mean, Diana's Panorama interview was obviously huge at the time. You know, that similarly in different ways, but it also kind of drew attention to these things and kind of made these conversations much more widespread. So I don't think it's unthinkable that the monarchy will bounce back from this. I think it kind of depends on how these conversations are taken up. And I think at the moment, what we're seeing is a lot of, to really simplify it, what we're seeing is these kind of Team Queen or Team Meghan kind of conversations happening. And I actually don't know if that's that useful. I think that's individualizing it, and that's making it about, I mean, it's making it about two women in particular, which is, of course, really complicated in terms of gender. But I think that's also ignoring, you know, these broader issues of the institution. So I think if we can manage to kind of turn the attention around to think about those things, then possibly. But I think it depends what's going to happen.
One more thing, just while we're talking right now, you just said you think it's not unthinkable that it'll bounce back, the institution, which presupposes that you think it is thinkable that it will not. I mean, just briefly sketch out that scenario. That's really the what happens next question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was always going to be questions when the Queen dies will be a really big turning point. And I think that's when we'll see So a lot of people's kind of attachment to the royal family, I think, and you can see this in kind of polls from YouGov and stuff, is to the Queen and to people's kind of respect for the Queen and not wanting to upset that status quo. And I think we've got to remember that, you know, the Queen is for the vast majority of us the only monarch people have ever known. And she's very much invested in this kind of, you know, this kind of modern Britain version. She's kind of got links to the war and to Churchill and to all these kind of stories we like to tell about ourselves. And I think when the Queen goes, that will be a really massive turning point. You know, Charles isn't that popular. So I think that was always going to happen, I think. And I wonder if this interview has, you know, rewritten those questions in interesting ways, because Charles was implicated directly in the interview as well. So is that going to start raising questions about him? Maybe. We'll see, I think.
Sorry, are you saying that he's implicated directly in relation to Meghan's remarks about race, or?
No, I don't know who that was. We haven't released
Right,
that, but Harry did directly talk about Charles and talked about his relationship with Charles as well. Yeah. So yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Dan, let me turn to you. We're very busy in the chat already, and we will try and keep an eye. You wrote in, I don't know if we still talk in terms of the week's issue of Time magazine, but I obviously read it online, of earthworks imperceptibly shifting under the royal family and a pendulum possibly being due a big swing back. So if we can stay with the sort of architectural metaphor, right? Do you foresee continued subsidence, or do you think it's more likely, bearing in mind perhaps some of the pretty solid support that we saw in those slides, that somehow or other they're going to do subsidence, I mean underpinning, which is that's what the builders call it, isn't it? And they go back in and find a way to shore the edifice up.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of thinking about it as a metaphor. When I was writing that's the last line of my piece. I was thinking, you know, is this a house that you know the foundations are rotting, or is it a castle wall where the sort of dirt around it is crumbling away a little bit? I do think it's probably the latter. These sorts of things, as Laura said, you know, that they've weathered these kinds of scandals in the past, and I point this out in the piece. So I mean, it was really inspired. You know, I write for Time magazine. My audience is primarily American, and one question I was getting a lot from my colleagues in the newsroom was, how can the royal family possibly survive this? And I think something that's worth maybe coming back to is the difference in how Americans perceive this to how Britons perceive this, because I think especially over the issue of race, which is such, you know, America is having this reckoning at the moment with its own history of race. And I think the idea that the royal family's relationship to race was somehow up for discussion, or that they had been exposed as institutionally racist, was something that may not be survivable. And so I thought, you know, well, why don't I point out that, you know, this is not necessarily to do with race, but in the past they have had these periodic scandals in the past that they've overcome by sort of closing ranks, and they have a media here in the UK that's very supportive of the royal family, and in fact derives a lot of its income and power from them. And you know, to think a little bit about, well, what is the thing that's going to change this? And I think Laura already raised this, which is when the Queen dies, the questions we will ask ourselves as a nation then, which I think is probably worth another piece at some point.
Definitely. It's a fascinating thing to think about, and the subject of one of the most compelling pieces of journalism published in English in recent years, when everything that could be planned about a death was sort of reported out in advance. But of course, there's so much that we cannot predict about how that will unfold, isn't there? Because we don't know enough about ourselves. That may, as you say, is a whole conversation, and we can spend more time on that as you like, if people want. I want to come, while it's still fresh in the chat, to Matt, if we can. You say you've become so much more royalist this week, and you've been astounded by the number of Americans expressing opinions on the family, saying it should be abolished, which relates to what Dan was just saying. Matt, I don't know if we can come to you, but if so, I'd love to ask why you're so astounded.
Yeah, I just found the very polarized opinions which came out of the interview a little bit surprising, particularly coming out of the US, where generally speaking, people, or at least we perceive in the UK, the people in the US are quite pro-monarchist, or at least they hold the royal family in a high regard. And then it seemed like out of one interview where, you know, as I said in the rest of the chat, I'm by no means a royalist at all myself, but I find it very strange that an interview where some of the claims were actually Harry and Meghan were contradicting themselves quite a lot in terms of what they were saying were actually quite different, even on the claim about how the baby would look, etc. I just found it very interesting how quickly people's opinions seem to change about the royal family. Like if you look online, you look on articles on Facebook where the comments or a lot of the stuff coming out of the New York Times had an article about it's time to abolish the monarchy. It was interesting how one interview just stirred up such a big hornet's nest, particularly coming from the US. And personally, I know, you know, for people of my age, say people under 40, this is totally the different view that most people have. But I actually felt a lot of sympathy for the Queen and for William especially, because they weren't able to defend themselves against these accusations. So I really did, you know, feel sorry for them when watching this interview. And I don't really understand what the purpose of that interview was. Like, what were they trying to really get out of it? So yeah, that was, you know, my perspective from watching it. It made me actually think about, you know, how difficult it would be that they can't formally respond. The system, in a way, the system doesn't allow them to actually respond to such an interview in a way, because as Dr. Clancy mentioned, the royal family have to keep this aura of mystique. So almost responding directly to each of those claims in a way would themselves be an issue for them, because they're supposed to in a way be above some of that. So it feels like for them as an institution and a family, it's a no-win scenario basically.
Okay, Matt, thank you very much. I want to ask you a question that I'm then going to ask both Dan and Laura before we go to the slides, and that is, what do you think of the dynastic principle itself? Yeah. Briefly. I think you're muted. Yeah.
Okay, great. I don't support the dynastic principle. You can see in my chat, I've started making some comments around the fact that I personally don't think the British royal family in itself is existing in a bubble. I think it's part of the wider system in England around our class system, the public school system, the House of Lords. I think all of those are intertwined in a way. So I don't support this, you know, a dynastic rule system. However, you know, I just going back to my point, what I found a bit rich coming from criticism from the US is this concept of the fact that they've had someone like Trump in power, and I really don't think they're ones that we should be looking at and taking any guidance when they elected someone like Trump. And I think what replaces it, I think, is almost like a whole nother discussion, because you get into so many different systems, different ways of doing things. So it almost becomes one of those questions of, the principle of having hereditary wealth and hereditary positions of power is not one I support, but I don't think there's an easy choice where we say, you know, if we have X, then this will instantly be better. I mean, if you look at the past few years, we could have had someone like Farage being president if we had an elected president or something like that, right? So it comes with its own challenges, particularly in the current environment that we have.
You've just made an extremely powerful case for a hereditary monarchy that I hadn't even thought of. Thank you very much. Dan, can I come back to you as a journalist rather than as a pundit? Perhaps you can channel the views of your editors and readers stateside. What do they think of the dynastic principle?
Well, I don't think they really understand it at all. And I think the idea of having a family born into power, it's just something that is very un-American, if you like. But I think, and there is something about the reaction of Americans and British to this that I think, goes against some of what Meghan and Harry did, go against what we might call British principles, right? Of sort of taking one for the team, and sort of abiding by duty and self-effacement and some of these things that the Queen is, I suppose, known for. And I think. Sorry, I've
no. I mean, it's hard to speak for 330 million people. I think this is something that I often come up against. But is it fair to say that until the interview, the US, insofar as Americans, insofar as they were interested in the British royal family, either regarded it as an amusing eccentricity, or if they chose to engage with it on a matter of sort of morals, then would probably be more Republican than royalist. I happen to know people over there who have massive collections of royal china and this kind of stuff, and want more than anything to meet the Queen. But then, of course, they're Republican, and as you say, the dynastic principle doesn't feel very American. But I wonder if what changed with the arrival of Meghan is this is one of their own in the picture. Forget the race component. Suddenly, this is no longer a far-off fairy tale. It's an organization that includes into which an American has married.
Right, and I think perhaps her expectations of what the royal family would be like. I mean, she said this in the interview, and this is probably, I mean, I don't want to get into the question of whether or not they were telling the truth, or, right, some of these things that have been they've been punditry about. But I do think the one thing that perhaps didn't ring true was that she hadn't done research on the royal family before joining it, and that she wasn't completely aware. I'm not sure how many seasons of The Crown had been around before she joined the royal family, but certainly that's the sort of thing that you could find quite easily by Googling. But I think, yeah, perhaps the ideas of social hierarchy that are quite embedded in the UK, and anyone who's lived with the royal family for as long as we all have, coming into that fresh and not understanding that, that if she had wanted to do that interview as a member of the royal family, there would have been people in the household saying, no, you absolutely can't do that. And I actually want to come back to The Crown, because I do think a lot of people around about the same time as Meghan and Harry got married, you had this hit Netflix show, right, which is incredibly popular in the United States, and I think has given a lot of people in America, I've certainly seen this among my colleagues and my friends in the US, what they think is an understanding. Because I think someone said to me in a meeting the other day, well, of course we all saw this thing happen in The Crown, and had to remind them that The Crown is a work of fiction. And the whole reason that we can have a crown and that it is realistic is that we have no idea what the Queen thinks about anything. And I mentioned this in the piece, actually, that she is content to be a mirror for what the nation does rather than a weather vane, I think was the phrase I had. And because she holds herself away from politics and is so unknowable, that allows television makers to come in and say, well, what if we did know more about her? But I think the perceptions that have grown around the royal family, I do think that the television show The Crown has a role to play in the popularity of the royals currently, but also in some of the perceptions that fed into this interview as well.
Thanks, Dan. I see we've got some hands up. We will come to you, Tom, Tanya, William. But first, I promise to come back to you, Laura. Do you think support for the dynastic you may have your own views, and I'm interested to know these, but as an academic researcher, do you think support for the dynastic principle in light of The Crown, in light of this, is solid or fragile?
I think it's a really interesting question. And again, I think I really, that point about The Crown is really interesting. And The Crown, to me, there is kind of some critical points of The Crown, I think quite interesting, actually critical points. But I think it also romanticizes that idea of monarchy in quite an interesting way. And it plays into this kind of this interest in kind of heritage culture and period that we seem to have, so like Downton Abbey, right? So it's very much the same kind of genre that romanticizes those class hierarchies. And to me, what it boils down to is that monarchy is about class, monarchy is about inequality. And that question of, I actually completely agree with Matt when he said, you know, getting a president won't fix everything. And I totally agree it won't. And I think, you know, but also, you know, we've had prime ministers. I don't particularly want Boris Johnson as my prime minister, but we have him. Like that, these things happen anyway. But I think it boils down to, you know, what kind of society do you want to be, and what kind of society do you want to be presented as? And to me, monarchy is kind of, you know, embodies inequality in all sorts of, you know, class inequality, gender inequality, race inequality. Like that is what monarchy is. So to me, it's not just, it's kind of, it boils down to that, and the practicalities of what happens next and stuff. Those obviously are really important questions. But I think, even if you think of it like ideologically, like what kind of society do we want to be? To me, it kind of boils down to that.
And is there any way of measuring, apart from polls that show support or otherwise for the monarchy, the extent to which people share that view that you've just articulated, that monarchy stands for inequality in class?
Well, I think what's really interesting, and this is from anecdotal evidence, like when I've spoken to people about this, and Republic, Graham Smith of Republic has also talked about this in terms of their statistics, that it's not so much that people love the royal family and love the idea of dynastic power, it's that they're kind of ambivalent, and that people don't really kind of engage with the fact, you know, how important monarchy is. Like people say to me, why are you researching that? Like people are living in poverty, there's much more important things to think about. And I've kind of said, well, no, actually monarchy is directly connected to all of those things. Like people want to talk about British people's obsession with social class and things, well, that's connected to monarchy. Like the ways in which inequality is legitimized is connected to our systems of hierarchy that are shown in the monarchy. So I think that it's not so much that people really love the monarchy, in my experience, it's that people don't engage. That I'm not saying they're not willing to, or they don't want to, or they're not, you know, I'm not saying that. I think there's just a kind of a general ambivalence around them, right. That people think, well, it's kind of an old-fashioned institution, it doesn't really matter, there's more important things to worry about.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Let us go to the slides, if we can, just to remind ourselves of certain realities.
Here they are. So we've been talking a bit about that interview, and it seems like that hasn't actually really shifted the dial on how people feel. So most people still sympathise with the Queen and the rest of the royals in this dispute, and not with Harry and Meghan. So you can see that it was about 38% that sympathised with the Queen before, and then that shifted down slightly to 36 afterwards. It's different with younger people. 48% of 18 to 24-year-olds say that they've got more sympathy for the Sussexes. And looking to the future, polling from the autumn last year found that most British people still think we should have a monarchy going forward. Again, younger people have less strong feelings about the royals. 42% think we should have a monarchy, and 34% think we should have an elected leader. So things might change a bit as that generation gets older. That said, if we look back in time a bit, the number of people who think we'd be better off without a monarchy really hasn't increased all that much in the last 30 years or so. So you can see that, you know, that green bar at the bottom, people who think that we'd be better off without them, hasn't really changed that much since 1991. And I think quite a few people are mentioning this in the chat, but one of the things that we should pay attention to when it comes to the royals is the sovereign grant. So this is a pot of money that the Treasury grants to the royals to pay for their official duties and things like the upkeep of Buckingham Palace. And normally, so between 2012 and 2017, the sovereign grant was set at 15% of the profits of the Crown estate. And now from 2017 onwards, that rose to 25%. And that was to pay for this 10-year refurbishment of Buckingham Palace. So that's why that dark green line goes up so much at that point. But the lighter green line down the bottom there shows you that the core spending, so that's the normal spending on official events without that Buckingham Palace refurb, has also gone up a lot since 2012, so by about 18 million. The third line in the middle there, the brown one, shows you how much of the grant the royals actually spend. And they don't spend all of it, and they certainly haven't in the last few years. But they don't have to give that money back. It's kept in a reserve fund to pay for future expenditure. We have quite a big number of full-time working royals who are entitled to that money from the sovereign grant, and Prince Charles has said he wants to slim down the monarchy and make it less expensive. And it looks like the public would support a scheme like that. Broadly, they think that the Queen, Charles and Camilla, and William and Kate should get public funding, and they are less sure about the others.
Thank you, Ella. So, even among 18 to 24-year-olds, the biggest single category, and I think it was slide 2, is we like the monarchy. And across the board, fewer than a fifth of people polled want it abolished. And those numbers are pretty solid over the years. And the point's been made to me in the chat that while some people, Laura, may feel ambivalence about the monarchy, there is also, and you see it every time there's a big TV event, sort of active, massive flag waving enthusiasm for the monarchy. And we can discuss why and how long that's going to last, and whether it's in fact a permanent feature of this eccentric country. But let's come to, I think Tanya run out of patience. So let's come to Tom first, because you've got your hand up. What's on your mind, Tom?
Hi there. Self-avowed Republican and also open-minded. I like the way Rory Sutherland, this is a Tortoise remains, although massively enhanced in the last year, you guys have done brilliantly. It remains a London-centric organization, viz the thinking yesterday. And I love Rory Sutherland's question that he asks of reverse thinking. So he'd say, if you lived outside London, would you consider moving back in? And it's worth looking up for people. But if we didn't have a monarchy, would we create one, given to represent us and the country that we are now in 2021? And I think that from that comes questions such as would we want such a body to represent, such as culture, morality, head of state, what does that mean? And people in the comments have noted much smaller, trimmed down hereditary monarchies that in their way represent Sweden or Spain. Spain perhaps not a good example right now. So I would just say that there's a bigger question that sits there with all of the changes in society. Do we just want to hold on to what we've got? As I also noted in the chat, people do tend to get more conservative and protective in their views as they age, linked to the slides. So it's just a question, I think, that's worth asking. And I think you're basically mooting that at some level today. Yeah. And there was the Farage point as well. I mean, there are many arguments to be made in favor of an unelected head of state. I suppose the question of whether you choose it by the hereditary principle is a somewhat separate one. William Jeremy, where do you stand on the status quo versus slim down?
Oh, hang on, I got to unmute.
No, we can hear you.
Yes. Well, I mean, as ever, all of this is bound up with, as Tom says, history and politics and culture. I think the head of state is an extremely important part of the whole consideration here, because, I mean, going into the future, because history tells us that at various times there have been enormous crises, and the monarchy has reinvented itself, whether that's the man that became Henry the Sixth, who invented the Tudor dynasty, or post the Civil War and Cromwell, when we cut off Charles I's head, and then we had the Cromwellian era, and then we invited the Dutch William of Orange back to be king because he was in line to the then Stuart throne. And then, the First World War, right. And, all these empires shaking. And so I think the latest manifestation of our affection for the personalities involved is very much bound up with what the Americans call the greatest generation. Now, very much, exiting the scene. We have the Duke of Edinburgh, 99, we have the Queen. And what was so, to me, sad about the whole Meghan and Harry thing was, I suppose I had great hopes that they, with William and Kate, would refashion what a head of state was for. And down the long road marked, the next half century, we will have to come up with a role for a head of state that's not necessarily dynastic. The whole dynastic thing can be a chimera in any event with the long historical sweep, but that's something else.
Let me just interrupt, William, because that's interesting what you just said, that you had great hopes for a refashioning of the role of head of state. I thought you were going to say you had great hopes that they would refashion the family. But look, William, I want to move on. So that we can include as many people as possible. If we can go to Heather Thomas, you've said in the chat, people seem to forget the Queen is the head of state for the Commonwealth. She certainly doesn't. She takes that role extremely seriously. Tell us about your anecdotal information, which you say is that this current crisis is playing out quite badly and may hasten more countries renouncing this and becoming republics. Can we come to you, Heather?
Hi, yes, good afternoon.
Hello.
Yes, I was born here. My parents are from Caribbean background, and so I come at this from a slightly different perspective. I have visited the Caribbean, and certainly growing up visiting the Caribbean, there were pictures of the Queen on the wall at my auntie's house, and so there's very close connection with the Caribbean, and indeed in Africa, where I visited too. But clearly, countries are developing, and we're aware of calls for reparations. We're aware of the drive really for race equality, not just in the United States, but across the world. And I think what the Harry and Meghan situation has done, and like many, I was very hopeful that this would lead to the dawn of a slightly different monarchy, a more modern monarchy, particularly as it had not just Meghan, but Harry, who seemed to bring a slightly different approach, and is very popular, my understanding is in the Caribbean and in Africa. But what the interview has done is really, I think, crystallize for people in the Commonwealth, people of colour in the Commonwealth, that clearly there are issues with a modern monarchy, and that maybe it's time actually for countries, if they really want to aspire to independence and shake off the roots of colonialism, to effectively renounce the monarchy and create and become into republics and have their own heads of state. And that's the point I'm making. So I'm saying that at a time when we keep talking about global Britain, and it was Commonwealth Day on Monday, and the royal family are out celebrating that. But actually, if you contrast that with what Meghan was saying, even the statement that came out from Buckingham Palace on Monday, which acknowledged that concerns about racism, but actually didn't come out with a very strong position on racism. It didn't say we as a family or we as a monarchy abhor racism. It didn't do that. So I think this is going to raise quite a lot of questions for the monarchy in terms of its relationship with the Commonwealth.
That's fascinating. It was more defensive than that, wasn't it? It was, recollections may vary. That's a really interesting point. And I think it's very plausible that Commonwealth countries peel off before we see a significant decline in sort of polled support for the institution over here. Do you have a sense, Heather, of where that process might start? I'm not suggesting that there's going to be a domino effect all over the world, but I mean, it is true, isn't it, that the Commonwealth has been in a sense, an institution in search of a purpose with an elevator pitch for some time. There's clearly a well-organized Republican movement in Australia, but I don't know if you know more about the Caribbean. Is it going to happen there first?
I think potentially it might. I mean, you might recall, I think last year, Barbados, if I remember rightly, talked about the potential of becoming a republic. I remember the Prime Minister there made a speech. And I know Jamaica has floated it in the past. So I imagine, what I'm saying is I can't imagine that the current situation has helped stop that process. I suspect it's going to accelerate it. Which will be the first country? I couldn't honestly say, Giles, but I think it will impact on it. And I should say as well, I mean, I have relatives in Canada and America. Obviously, America's not part of the Commonwealth, but even in Canada, amongst people of colour, this is playing out very badly. Everybody watched the interview. Everybody's watched that interview. And it's particularly also not playing that well in America. Now, there are lots of monarchists in America, but certainly, again, speaking to people of colour in America, this is not playing well. And you imagine at a time, America's going through a time where it's trying to come to terms with lots of the racial division it had last year, result from George Floyd. We've got Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, a woman of colour, as vice president. They're doing a lot of work now to try and address some of the concerns in America. So at this time, for this interview to be coming out, again, I would argue, certainly for people of colour in America who are becoming more influential, it is not a good look for the United Kingdom and for the monarchy.
I agree. I agree with you. Yes, and let's not forget that in the 90s, countries were actively joining the Commonwealth. They were queuing up to join. Which puts me in mind of the pendulum, Dan, that you mentioned in your piece. Can you peer into your crystal ball? Always a bad thing for a journalist to do. But if the pendulum swings back in this country, we'll compartmentalize the Commonwealth for a bit. Do you think that the single most likely outcome is a North European style slimmed down family rather than a sort of an angry abolition?
I think that's right. I just made this that comment in the chat here. In fact, that there are lots of ways for the the royal family to lose power without being abolished completely. I think that's what happened in Spain, is that they lost their sovereign status, for example. If Commonwealth countries like Barbados decide to peel off, I think the point I was making there about the pendulum swinging back is, if the royal family allows itself to become politicized, and one thing that the YouGov figures didn't quite determine was how support for the royal family breaks down across political identity, because if they become seen as a conservative versus Labour force, and if they don't rise above politics in the way that the Queen does, then eventually, when the pendulum does shift, as political pendulums tend to do, there will be a party that looks at numbers and decides that perhaps now is the time to have a referendum, or to do something completely unpredictable along the sort of lines as we did in 2016, when when the whole situation does become politicized. And you know, public support is quite fickle. I think I also said this in the chat. You know, if you look at the polling over the, I mean, to use the most obvious example, the European Union, where support for that kind of went a little bit all over the place before we had the referendum, and then you know, became this big politicized thing. So yeah, I think especially in these quite volatile times, public opinion can be shifted one way or the other by a party that is able to draw power from divisions in society. And if the royal family is subject to those, then I don't see that it's impossible that could happen at some point in the future. That
Right.
the future of the monarchy becomes a question that we're asked to decide.
Right. So fickle public opinion, and sort of sensitive to catalysts, and arguably the interview was a catalyst. Laura, I wanted to come back to the point that you made about the monarchy, in a sense, standing for inequality in class. Would you go as far as to say that the principle of the monarchy, which basically says by an accident of birth, these people are on a pedestal, they're different, they're better. What's the difference between that and racism? Is it intrinsically racist in that sense?
Yeah, and I think Heather actually made some really great points here around, you know, we're thinking about this nationally, but actually, you know, internationally. And the monarchy is connected to this history of colonialism and history of empire, and it can't be, and they're still benefiting from that wealth in lots of ways as well. You know, the crown jewels, for example, there's loads of, you know, loads of information around that. So I think, you know, if we look at it in those much in broader ways as well, that's really important. If I could just pick up on what Dan just said as well, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Around kind of political beliefs around monarchy. So actually YouGov released some really interesting statistics. I think it was maybe October last year that showed that people who tended to vote Labour and voted Remain in the Brexit referendum were more likely to support Harry and Meghan. And people who voted Conservative and voted Leave in the European Union were more likely to support the Queen or the monarchy, whatever you want to call it. So I think these, you know, I think this really speaks to the ways that Meghan has been taken up as a public figure, as a woman of colour at a time, and she came into the royal family at a time of incredibly divisive politics in Britain. It almost directly maps onto Brexit, her entrance into the royal family. And I think that we can't separate those two. And actually this idea of Megxit, this term that we've all picked up and we all use, when you look at the history of like Twitter, that term was originally being used by really far right protesters to protest that Meghan should leave, that Meghan shouldn't be marrying into that monarchy. Like it was like a far right hashtag that's now been taken up quite commonly. And I don't mean everyone means it in that same way, of course, but I just mean that these connections between Meghan and kind of this, you know, the stigmatization of left-wing woke generation politics absolutely exists. And I think a lot of the reaction that we see to Meghan is to do with this, you know, what people are calling the culture wars, and how that is completely connected to issues of gender, issues of race, totally. You know, we're situating this in a time of Black Lives Matter, as Dan said earlier, like in this moment of, you know, in theory, we're meant to have this increased awareness of race in society, whether that's true or not, you know, is a different matter. We can see that in Piers Morgan and his kind of reactions to Meghan, and how his hatred of Meghan kind of became this, you know, real cornerstone in some of these debates. So I think all of the, you know, Meghan can't be extracted from all of those wider things that happen in society, and nor can the monarchy, especially now there appears to be a wedge between Meghan and the monarchy.
That is really fascinating. Of course, all this discussion relates to a family that furnishes us with heads of state, and as Matt noted much earlier on, if you do away with our current system, you've got to probably come up with an alternative. And I did warn Matt D'Ancona that I might ask him if he's around for, in a sense, the case for the monarchy. And you said you're more of a queenist than a monarchist, but can you address the thorny problem of how you choose a head of state who has broad popular support if you don't do it this way?
What if you don't have a monarchy?
Yeah.
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, that's one of the many reasons why we still have a royal family and a monarchy, because we took a very distinct and clear decision as a country in the late 18th century, unlike America and France, to stick with a monarchy and move towards a constitutional monarchy even more. And then there was parliamentary reform in the 19th century and the enfranchisement of women in the 20th, and so on and so on. And the British way has always been, but it's called, the Whig version of history, the incremental reform. Now, it's certainly the case that way of doing things is beginning to look a bit frayed. And I think one of the reasons for the rise of identity politics is that and David Lammy is very, very eloquent on this, is that the British way of incremental reform is no longer commands as much support as it did. The problem is that it is such a huge lift to go from something as embedded in the system and entrenched as the monarchy to another system that would command popular support, because as we discovered in the Brexit referendum, it's easy to say no. The more difficult bit is to say yes to something. And I personally find it hard to envisage on top of because we do have a very clearly parliamentary system in this country. So you'd have to superimpose above that a politically elected president as head of state, and that's a big change. Other countries in Europe have it. It's doable, but moving from one to the other is a big shift. And my reticence about it is that, at the moment, politicians don't have the bandwidth to sort out the Irish border or test and trace.
Right.
Asking them could you come up with a system that will bind the nation that is already heavily divided over what sort of head of state we can have, when most of them quite like the Queen and have her on their tea towel, even though, as has been very correctly said, there are huge flaws in the institutions, and it represents a social vision that is plainly outdated and a dynastic approach that is plainly indefensible. The problem is, what's the alternative? Just to end with another twist, though, I mean, the only reason I think there is a smidgen of possibility that it could happen is that we now live in an era of unbelievable volatility, in which the values of show business count for more than the inherited conventions of institutions, right? And what the Harry and Meghan interview was all about was using the thermonuclear power of the entertainment world against a crusty old institution that works in statements and ritual and, gloved hands and courtiers. And it was a direct hit. It was an absolutely direct, a Hiroshima level hit. And so in the same way that it would have been unthinkable until 2016 for an idiot failed tycoon and but successful reality star like Trump to become president, there may come a time when the showbizification of culture is so extreme that the idea actually of flipping the monarchy to something different becomes thinkable. Because the nature of our culture is shifting so rapidly. I do think that was why it was so extraordinary. It was no accident they chose Oprah. It was no accident that they gave the more practiced of the two performers, that was Meghan, the bulk of the action. Harry was halting, damaged.
He's pretty fluid, actually.
Yeah, but Meghan was fantastic. I mean,
right.
She's off the hook, fantastic. I mean, every line was just a killer line. I mean, Harry was kind of compellingly honest and open, and I think a rather tragic person. I mean, you could see how damaged he's been by his life. But what I mean is that Meghan was awesome. She just went in there and used, as has been said several times in the discussion, using trigger words like the firm. Fantastic. I mean, this was a very, very practiced and very effective hit done by a very, very good performer. And it may be that the monarchy will tumble under that kind of pressure, but not yet, I think.
Thank you very much, Matt. I mean, you remind me that the context is, as you say, if we think of alternatives, European countries that have elected presidents, one thinks of Germany, one thinks of Israel. These are both countries that sort of had to restart themselves or were founded from scratch. But let's not forget the other model, which is Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, slimmed down, kind of sensible, as opposed to Ruritanian royals. And I do want to come back to Laura and Dan on that just in the last couple of minutes on what the practical next steps might be. But Gajinder, I just want to come to you before we do, because you said you think this whole argument is a red herring. Are you there, Gajinder?
Yeah, hello.
Hi, why is it a red herring?
I just wonder if we make the argument that the Queen doesn't hold much power and doesn't really play a role in our democracy, I wonder what difference it would make to make the Prime Minister head of state and head of government if the Queen wields kind of little or no power. We don't need to radically reform the system. I wonder if you could just keep the system as it is with the House of Lords, a weak House of Lords and a strong House of Commons, and just remove the monarchy. I wonder why we have to kind of, in this argument, why we always say we have to have a head of state to replace this head of state. No,
fair enough. I mean, I think the scenario in which you combine both roles in one person is perhaps the least discussed. Let me go just with about 30 seconds left for each of us. Dan, if I can come back to you, what do you think is the single most likely model for British selection of its head of state in 2030?
I think I actually agree with Matt Dagona. I don't think it's going to be that quickly, that happen that quickly. Yeah, I do think, I mean, you were going to ask about the dynastic principle, and I do think there is something to be said for consistency in a time when we don't have a lot of that. But I think that until the Queen does pass away, we're not going to see rapid change. But I think when that does happen, I do think, I mean, I said this in my piece, but I think that is going to be a huge psychic blow to this country, where it's going to open up all kinds of conversations, because, and I think Laura said this, you know, it cuts that tie between the age of empire and whatever age it is we're in now. And the reason that I don't know what age we're in now is because we haven't decided yet. And I think that's when we're going to begin having those conversations. So whether that happens in 2030 or before, I don't know. But I think that's going to be the time when we might have to have an even more interesting conversation.
Okay, thank you. Laura, I'll give you the last word. And again, coming back to what the monarchy means, clearly it is now a big part of the national identity, has been for many years. Let's not forget that a lot of people may be ambivalent, but a lot of people are actively in favor. Do you think that this might be a tipping point in terms of the deference that we afford them? Is our attitude to the family changing in that respect? The curtsying, for example.
Well, possibly, but I think, you know, what's still really interesting is that even Harry and Meghan were saying, well, it's not the Queen, you know, the Queen is amazing.
Oh, that's
so
true.
Even at that level, that was still happening. So I don't know. I agree with that. I think 2030 is too early. I don't think much would have changed by then. But I think that, you know, at the moment, people say, oh, we could have, you know, we don't want a president, we don't want this, we don't want that. Well, at the moment, we're not even having a conversation of what we want and what that could look like. Like if someone could maybe sit down and outline some options, maybe that might help.
Right.
kind of see what people might, you know, what people might want or what different options there might be. So I think that process of even just having that conversation and kind of thinking practically on what that would literally mean in terms of actually making these changes would help. Because I think at the moment, you're right, it's kind of an unknown because we just don't have that conversation.
Laura, thank you very much. Good luck with indexing or whatever stage you've got to with the book. It's been a really actually eye-opening conversation for me, and I didn't have to go nuclear myself with any of my own views. Matt came in with an assessment of the interview as a thermonuclear strike all on its own. I think Heather's point that if we see support for the institution crumbling, we'll see it first in the Commonwealth, is a really important one. Laura and Dan both made the point that the Queen's death, whenever it comes, is going to be a huge turning point. And there'll be a broad reassessment then. And Laura, I think if you were just now making the argument for a constitutional convention where we actually sit down and have a civilized conversation about the way forward for the royal family, whether we want it, what shape it needs to take, then I think it's a really good one. I think we should host it at Tortoise. Look, I hope it's been interesting for everybody else. This conversation will run it's woven into our fabric, like it or not, as a society. James, I didn't really think that leader I wrote for you all those years ago was bilge. I did my best. Have a great weekend, and do join us again Monday evening for our next Thinking, and next Friday for our next Sensemaker Live Thinking. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.